been kind of a ritual for everybody to thank me and Doug in the beginning of, of their talks, and so I wanted to thank you and just say that I've just enjoyed this summer tremendously, and I'm so recharged from these discussions that we've been having, and so thank you all, and I've learned a lot from you. So as I was rereading my paper that my think piece, I should say, that I sent you, I noticed two typos I made, and they're telling. One of them is I was to write living in Berlin, and I wrote loving in Berlin. I know. So that tells you everything. And the other one is that instead of saying Smedley, I said Agnes. And and I think this tells you something about the personability of this figure that seems to leap across the pages, and the fascination for this figure that is not only maybe present in my piece, but present really in most of the literature on her. And that's very difficult to navigate, as I've tried to get into in the paper. So some of the biographers also call her Agnes, which to me was first jarring, and then I started understanding why. So I wanted to just touch on a few points that were important for me to work out in this paper, and that I think I want to push further, and I'm really looking for your input on this. Like Doug and Shrikant, I'm interested in a figure who is not strictly a scientist, but I think who is a sexologist in some ways, I would argue. She's a journalist, she's an activist, and I think she becomes an important figure for sexology in the way she contributes to the literature of sexology through her articles and through her activism in this field. And this is not a point I make very much in the paper, but I think it's a point I could add to the paper. So thinking about her also, and thinking about our discussions, I was wondering if there are sexologists who are really strictly scientists. And we've talked a lot about what sexology is constituted of, and you know, even people with medical training like Hirschfeld use a knowledge base, you know, of ethnography, personal experience, letters, travel, you know, activism. So, you know, can we judge the science by the knowledge base? That seems problematic. Can we judge it by the way in which they move in scientific networks, for example, in conferences and so on? But there seems to be a lot of overlap also. So the birth control review that Smedley publishes in, for example, is a very hybrid journal where you have scientists, you know, publishing, but sexologists really of all different backgrounds. So I think it might be productive to think about sexology as similar to psychoanalysis in that regard, that it is a kind of different type of science, a modern science, and also modernist kind of science, which is one of the claims I'm making in the paper. In the figure of Agnes Smedley, a lot of different contexts come together. She works as a representative for Margaret Sanger in different countries, first in the US, in Germany, and China. She's a birth control activist, a sex reformer, feminist. She's analyzed at the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. She's a champion of Indian independence from colonialism. She's first a socialist and a communist, a Maoist. She's a working class writer, and she's a spy. I was so excited. Could have made her up. I think here you have all these different global discourses, of course, that are coming together. And I think a lot of them are heavily invested, and this was the surprise to me in this project. So they're heavily invested in actually writing the sexual self. So, and this is a modern project, writing the sexual self. How do you integrate the sexual self into the modern idea of self? That's the project that's also playing out in all these different networks. So it's a shift from what you do to who you are, and we've described this in this institute in different instances also. So a shift from thinking about practice to thinking about a modern subjectivity. And of course, this becomes also part of narratives of progress and of achieving modernity. So integrating this sexual self is a very important project, I think, at this historical moment. In our conversation yesterday, Angie actually reminded me that someone had mentioned Engels as a sexologist here in this seminar. It was Pablo. Okay.
Who was the sexologist?
Friedrich Engels.
Oh, yeah.
And I think actually that's for this paper that's very true in a way that I think communism was also very invested in defining this idea of the sexual self, and in this way here it really overlaps with the sexological project and works into it. And there are other narratives that are part of this that I haven't mentioned here, but of course there's also a fascist narrative of the sexual self, which, for example, Dagmar Herzog has worked on. So I think the science of sexology, coming back to the beginning, plays a big role in this project of how to write the sexual self. And I think it plays in different ways into these different networks I'm trying to describe. And in some ways, these different networks also feed back into sexology. So it's really an interaction. What I looked at more closely for this paper is the overlap of psychoanalysis and sexology in writing the modern sexual self. And as I mentioned already, I've termed them modernist sciences. And I think in the seminar, only in the seminar, I became aware of how much Freud was actually read as a sexologist also, and internationally read as a sexologist by people like Takahashi Tetsuo and Artie Carvin. And I think this serves as a reminder that we should be cautious not to read texts just in the traditions that they set out to be read in by the people who produce these texts. So not just reading Freud as the founder of psychoanalysis, but that we need to read him as a sexologist in conversation with other sexologists, even if he didn't think of himself in that way. As I tried to show in my paper, psychoanalytic knowledge on sex tries to set up a framework of gaps for the sexual self. So psychoanalysis becomes a project that helps align the psychological and the biological sex for Smedley. And so psychoanalysis serves in a way to addressing gaps in the sexual self, but it also fails in some ways. So there's the gap between sexual desire and sexual practice that's always going to be there in psychoanalytic theory. So there's something that never can be aligned, and there's a certain brokenness and gap in the modern sexual self that becomes part of this sexological framework, and that's expressed also in these letters. So in looking at these letters to and from Smedley, I was interested how these frameworks of the sexual self are actually being integrated in practice, and how people actually come to conceive of themselves as sexual beings, as people who don't just do, but who are something sexual, and how these different frameworks are juggled simultaneously and almost collaged together. And so in Smedley's case and Ali's case, the desire to have a revolutionary marriage, the wish to consolidate biological and psychological sex, or the feminist perception of men as sexually stuck in some evolutionary stone age. So all these levels come together here. Sexology, like psychoanalysis, becomes part of what Foucault has described as technologies of the self, tools of constructing a sense of a coherent personal identity that then becomes naturalized, so it comes to be seen as natural or essential and can be narrated again. So maybe I can work with that vein. We'll see. I wanted to show you in relation to the global, I wanted to show you just one image actually. And so this is Smedley, and this is an image from the Modern Review, and a journal based in Calcutta, where she published quite a bit, and where she wrote, for example, also about Indian women. She became an expert on that. And I found this fascinating, actually, this kind of staging of herself as Indian. And this is also something that comes up in the correspondences that she has with the editors of the journals that she publishes in, that they start addressing her as Indian and say, you know, you're really Indian. You have an Indian soul, and you know, she was never there. Of course, that's the irony here. So that the global, of course, is not just an actual space, but also a space of texts that are circulating, a space of imagination. So I'll leave it here and look forward to your responses.
So most of my questions for you have to do with developing your argument about the relationship between, quote, the liberational rhetoric of leftist politics, national independence, sexual rights, feminism, and psychoanalytic introspection, end quote. I think this is really exciting, and my excitement about the potential implications of your analysis of Smedley's life and work animates and guides my queries. In general, I think the claim needs more unpacking and elaboration, and its implications more nuanced development. I'll try to offer specific thoughts to that effect. So, one, you describe these connections as intrinsic. I'd like to ask you to unpack that. I think if you more carefully explained what you meant by it, these things are intrinsically connected, you would have a very interesting argument. So your readings seem to suggest that these discourses of national independence, psychoanalytic introspection, sexual rights, and feminism are politically and strategically connected, often intimately interwoven by Smedley and her colleagues in ways that tell us something about what they could mean vis-a-vis one another, not what they intrinsically are. So I would ask, how are they connected here, not just you know, that they are connected here. How are they connected here? And how is the way that they're connected here different from how we normally imagine or narrate their relationships to one another? So, second, following up, what existing narratives does your story about the ways in which these discourses are interwoven disrupt? What does your analysis of these materials mean for the study of sexology, for the historiography of feminism, which I have thoughts about that we could talk about later, for that of leftist politics, for that of anti-colonial movements, and sexual liberationist ones, psychoanalytic or personal growth work narratives, and so on. Are there ways in which these projects are imagined as interconnected in Smedley's life, thinking, and politics that challenges the way we think about their relationship in any number of these historiographies? What I'm getting at is that there are a variety of kinds of narratives about how these issues are connected. In different spaces, we tell different stories about this. We aren't looking here at an absence of any narrative about their interconnection. So I would push you to state more clearly what is implicit, I think, about what you're writing against. So I've outlined some of the stories that sprang to my mind. So there are stories about how alternately or collectively feminism or the politicization of sexuality distract from the real work of anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, or anti-racist work. And there are critical stories about how masculinist and heterosexist these movements have been. And then there are those narratives that recenter women and queers in the histories of these movements. I'm thinking here, for example, of work on feminism in the Black Panther Party in revolutionary Cuba and in the Indian independence movement, and a growing body of work on feminism and anarchist movements, which I thought might be really helpful to you, has similarly documented the importance of sexuality within anarchist feminist discourse and the loudness of anarchist feminist voices within larger anarchist movements. For example, this piece called No God, No Boss, No Husband. Be useful. There are also stories about how feminist and sexual liberationist discourses have been complicit in racist and imperialist projects. Here I'm thinking, for example, of literature on pinkwashing and gentrification. Michelle Newman's White Women's Rights beautifully documents the process by which white feminists established themselves as political actors on the backs of other women in late 19th and early 20th century U.S. politics. And psychoanalysis occupies an interesting place in these movements and is not super cemented in any of these narratives that spring to my mind, which I thought was interesting because neither is it absent altogether. So that seems an interesting place to push and think about how we might imagine the relationships between these things differently. I'll say more about that in a little bit. So all that is to say, if these things are intrinsically connected, it's not in any straightforward way. So I would ask, what do your sources suggest about the ways in which they could be connected in our political practices, broadly construed, movement and relational work, so on and so forth. And 3, some implications I drew from your reading of the letters between Smedley and Ali included 1, politicizing psychoanalysis, 2, criticizing the co-optation of sexual liberation by misogynist or pro-family interests, 3, criticizing the framing of white middle-class feminist and sexual liberationist projects, including the study of sexuality, as somehow analogous to other liberationist projects like civil rights instead of imbricated with them, and criticizing attempts to separate realms of public and private political interest. So to give a clarifying example, I think you have company in, and that this history provides important narrative resources for moves, for example, like critiquing immigration reform that fights for marriage rights for same-sex partners instead of joining the struggle for immigration rights in general. Lastly, returning to psychoanalysis, I think that you're onto something that seems to be a strong and consistent, but maybe somewhat buried thread throughout your paper. And it's something that you might call an ethics of self-reflexivity that ties all of these discourses together. And I would be interested to see how that might develop. So I think it powerfully disrupts this liberationist versus pathologizing debate about the implications of sexology by suggesting the existence of a strategy for navigating complicity from a place of cognizance about the interconnectedness of all of these things that you catalog, rather than establishing an outside or a place of innocent objective knowing and acting, an epistemological view from somewhere rather than nowhere. So to turn to a specific moment in the text to clarify what I mean is on page 15, you say, in this letter, writing personal history, writing political history, and writing science become one. I wanted to ask you, how does this genre and the explicit positionality of the author and of the mode of writing personally shift what science and politics mean, and thus open up possibilities for the historian of sexology to imagine the deployment of sexuality as complex and multiple in its political implications, while acknowledging it as always having political effects beyond the realm of what we imagine as sexuality.
Okay, Pablo? This is a fascinating paper, and I wanted to be Agnes Smedley, I want to say. So, it was so it was a pleasure for me to see how you trace your encounter with the figure of Smedley while you were working on another topic, and how this led to an increasing interest not only in her work and persona, but also in the broader implications of her political work and sexual ideas. Agnes Smedley, Veronika explains, was at the crossroads of a variety of global discourses and networks: sexology, psychoanalysis, feminism, communism, and the Indian independence movement. If we had to choose a historical character to epitomize the notion of a nomadic subject, Agnes Smedley would fit the bill perfectly. As I prepared to comment on this paper, I became fascinated with Smedley and the way Veronika narrated her story. Before I read Veronika's paper, I had a look at a biography of Smedley written by Ruth Price. The book emphasizes Smedley's political commitment, her role as a Soviet spy for, as a spy for the Indian independence movement, and the Soviets in China feature very strongly in this narrative. Smedley's role in the development of international networks of sexual science, however, appear either as a minor hobby or as a distraction. Sometimes her association with Sanger and the birth control movement is even presented as a cover for her work as a spy. In the analysis presented by Veronika instead, we come to realize how important sexual reform was for Smedley, and how connected it was with her own psychoanalysis and life history. This is something new that Veronika does in her paper, but that I think she should emphasize for those of us that may not know about her before and the ways of telling her story. Although I do not think Veronika needs to engage in a direct discussion with the biography written by Ruth Price, it is worth noting that her understanding of Smedley drives us away from the most typical interpretations of her life. Veronika should probably be more explicit about the originality of her work here. Having experienced 2 traumatic illegal abortions that Smedley described as turning points in her life, it is unlikely that she took her commitment to birth control movement lightly. And Veronika illuminates that part of Smedley's life, often obscured by the echoes of Cold War tensions. Defended by many as a victim of McCarthyism, Smedley became a huge disillusion for those who found, after the fall of communism, that she had actually been a spy for the Soviets and not a mere naive casualty of the post-war Red Scare. Veronika points this out explicitly, but I think she should emphasize how, in discussing if Smedley was guilty or innocent and in evaluating her political commitments, Smedley's interest in sexual science and her relationship with feminism and psychoanalysis have been undermined or even hidden. Veronika brings a fresh approach to Smedley's life that at the same time illustrates a much broader point that has been crucial for our institute, Global Networks. She provides an interest for this topic by forcing us to rethink disciplinary boundaries and the idea of science and an idea of science divorced from politics. Sexology and politics were never 2 separate fields, and they need to be considered as overlapping spheres. This thread in Veronika's work connects to the work that we're all doing. In her analysis of overlapping spheres and global interconnection, Veronika complicates how these connections operated, how they were both formed by allies but also by enemies. So the conflict between Smedley and Hirschfeld is a case in point where in the opening of the birth control clinic in Berlin that Sanger was promoting from New York, Smedley did not want Hirschfeld to be part of that, right? And said homosexuality has to be kept out of the public discussion, it will undermine birth control and all of that. When it comes to politics, however, I think there's a weak point there in pointing out the tensions, and I think trying to see the tensions in these networks that are related to political difference may be a productive thing to think about. So I think one of the issues in that sense that I find like a little bit problematic is how she sometimes is described as a communist, and the tensions with communism are not very clear, although she had many tensions there, and I think they were very important to interrogate her sexuality, her understanding of sexuality. As wife of Chattopadhyaya, or partner of Chattopadhyaya, Smedley embraced a form of what, in lack of better words, I would describe as radical nationalism rather than communism. So Chattopadhyaya believed that India was not ripe for revolution and needed independence first. Although he courted Soviet Russia for funding, it is not clear to me that he was a full-blown communist. Smedley was first fascinated with the 1917 revolution. When she went to Moscow in the 1920s, she was deeply disenchanted with the revolution after her meeting with Emma Goldman. And Veronika refers to Smedley's friendship with Goldman, who was an anarchist, but I think you do not consider so much the implications of such friendship. And it would seem that the bond between Smedley and Goldman shaped her views on introspection and sex. Although Smedley would eventually become a spy for the Soviets in China, her relationship with communist Russia was always ambivalent and complex. She became a spy and a communist organizer in Shanghai because she was convinced that the Chinese Revolution could trigger an Asia-wide anti-colonial movement, but she publicly criticized the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, Smedley's criticism of communist Russia was welcome and even encouraged by the Soviets, as it was the perfect cover to deny that she was a spy for them. Blazing up political tensions as her role as a spy, Smedley was able to work for the Soviets to advance her colonial goals, while criticizing Soviet Russia and at the same time collaborating with that regime. Political tensions allowed Smedley to carve out a space, it would seem, for autonomy in the midst of Stalinism's rise. And I think that may be important to understand her thinking of sexuality. In addition to thinking politics, I think politics is important in another way. If the biography written by Ruth Price downplays Smedley's participation in psychoanalysis and birth control movement, I think Veronika does a little bit of the opposite. In Veronika's works, the politics of Smedley are often located on a par with her involvement in birth control and psychoanalysis, and I think she didn't see them as equally important, and that has to be probably considered a little bit further. By pointing out the prominence of politics in Smedley's life, it is possible to bring more complexity, I think, to the overlapping networks that Veronika is trying to illuminate. In fact, one of the main tensions with that network was the very fact that many activists in radical politics in the early 20th century were ambivalent towards issues such as sexual liberation. So sexology and psychoanalysis were perceived by right-wingers as synonymous with communism, but within the communist camp, the twin disciplines were often seen as a minor issue, a distraction from most important topics, or even a dangerous commitment. And Agnes Smedley did have this view to some extent. And yet communists and anarchists were among the most fervent supporters of sexual science and sexual liberation. This is the tension I think needs further elaboration, and Smedley illustrates this tension in a way that is lost if we downplay her understanding of politics, I think. Finally, I think there's two things that could be elaborated a little bit further, which is her relationship with avant-garde literature, because I think the way she represents herself, and there's a kind of life scripting that's related to a technique of montage that's related to avant-garde literary movements at the time, the 1920s, and with this debate about proletarian culture and a culture that can, a communist culture, or and that might be related to your discussion of modernist subjectivity, which I think is like kind of underdefined in the paper. Throughout the paper you talk about modern, but then at the end we have modernist, and it's not clear like what's the role there. Thank you for introducing me to this fascinating character. It was amazing, and your paper was like really amazing. So I really enjoyed it.